very happy to have Professor Siegel give the next talk. Professor Siegel is Emeritus Professor at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. She's a Professor of Education and Counseling Psychology and Special Education. She has conducted extensive studies of dyslexia and other learning disabilities, as well as cognitive and language development. She is the President-elect of the IARD, the International Academy for Research in Learning Disabilities. She has published many papers in scientific journals, as well as book chapters. And today she'll be giving a talk entitled Fluency Matters, a cross-linguistic study of the role of fluency in reading comprehension and spelling. So we're very happy to have you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. The talk, like many of the others in this conference, is dedicated to Zvia. Zvia was a wonderful person, kind, compassionate, and we all miss her very much. But she was also insightful. And she is responsible for me giving the kind of talk that I'm giving today. Zvia was really pioneering in her analysis of reading and the role of fluency in reading. And I was very skeptical about whether or not we should even consider fluency. And I was biased very much by my experiences with English and listening to dyslexic and non-dyslexic children and adults reading in English. Because in English, because of the huge vocabulary and the particular inconsistency between letters and sounds, accuracy is a very good measure of reading proficiency, or at least I thought it was. Zvia gradually convinced me that fluency was equally important, and perhaps in some cases more important. So this talk is about fluency. And for some reason that nobody can figure out, the title does not appear on the first slide, although it is on my computer. So this is some problem with the Mac PC interaction. But anyway, you heard the title. So the way we conceptualize and define fluency was the speed with which one reads words. And in the task we used, they're isolated words, either words or pseudo-words. We used both. And there are other measures of fluency, which are reading in context, but I think there are problems with these measures because there are clues to the words if you're reading a text, but if you're reading isolated words, there are no clues to what they are. So for me, it's a measure of word retrieval. And fast and efficient word retrieval is very important, I think, for reading comprehension. Because as you read, you have to process incoming information and also remember what it is that you've read. And that is, to me, a complex working memory task. So the faster that you can get the words in, the easier it is to remember. So I'm going to be talking about reading comprehension and its relationship to fluency and other processes in different languages. First of all, we used both dyslexics who were less than the 20th percentile on a word reading test, and typical readers who are between the 40th and the 75th percentile. And we had 4 languages in the study: English, Swedish, Estonian, and Croatian. These languages were chosen for a variety of reasons. First of all, they differ significantly in the predictability of letter-sound correspondence. English, as you all know, is unpredictable in many cases. Swedish is not as unpredictable as English, but according to the estimates, about 75% predictable. Estonian and Croatian are about 99, maybe 99.9% predictable, and the words that aren't predictable are borrowed words from other languages. However, these languages differ in another critical dimension, and that is the grammatical structure, the grammatical complexity. And to give you an example of this, well, first of all, this is the sentence, "Fluency is important in understanding dyslexia." So this is, the first one is Swedish, then Croatian, and then Estonian. So just to give you, if you weren't convinced already, here is just an example of some of the unpredictability of letter-sound correspondences in English. So initial G has 2 pronunciations, G and J, and even followed by the same letter, which is an I, there are still 2 pronunciations. And there's no way of knowing, unless you know the vocabulary word, which pronunciation of G you should use. So, and this is relevant to some of the things I'm going to say later on, but certainly you can't read letter by letter in English for many of the words. Okay. So, but these languages differ in another way, and in probably other ways also, but this is, to me, it's the most dramatic one. This is the noun book, and these are the inflections that you can have on the noun book. In English, book is also a verb, but we're talking about the noun. So this is an example of the inflectional structure, the syntactic structure. So Swedish is very similar to English, but look at Estonian and Croatian. This is the word book and all of the possible inflections that you can have on it. It's obviously a different syntactic structure, and I would argue a more complex syntactic structure, and that, as we'll see, is relevant for reading comprehension. So we had 3 reading tasks that we used: reading words, reading pseudo-words, and reading comprehension, and this was accuracy. But we also had fluency measures of reading words and pseudo-words. And as at the time that we did this work in English, there was no standardized test of fluency. There are now, but I borrowed the idea from my Dutch colleagues who looked at the number of words that could be read in 1 minute. So we also examined some other processes in reading: phonological awareness, syntactic awareness, working memory, and fluency, which for me is a marker of, as I said, word retrieval, but also vocabulary. There are many measures of vocabulary in English and other languages, but I don't think they capture quite what is relevant to reading. And so this is your retrieval of words and pronunciation of words and the structure of words. So I think that's a critical process in reading. Okay. So phonological, I should have said we had parallel tasks in these 4 languages. The phonological awareness task was a phoneme and syllable deletion task. An example of English was say the word location, say it without K. Now, what is different about this task is that it's not initial phoneme or syllable deletion. One of the difficulties and one of the issues in measuring phonological awareness is that on many of the tasks that have been used, people reach ceiling very early, maybe in grades 3 or 4. But these were, for the most part, medial deletions, and that is much harder. And we did get some good variance on this measure. Now, we also used a measure called oral close, which is a measure of processing of the syntax of the language. And so an example in English would be, and I'm going to say beep when there's a missing word, Dad, beep Bobby a letter yesterday. So you have to obviously supply the past tense and the correct form of the verb. So we had a number of sentences like this, trying to use the critical, or some of the critical features of the language. And the idea behind this was, when you're reading, you need to make predictions about the words that come next in the text in order to read quickly and efficiently. And so if you're more aware of the structure of the language, then I think that's something that can facilitate reading comprehension. So here's an example of some of the sentences that we used, and there were some more complex ones also. And I want to stress this is an oral task. But now it's about 10 years ago, we had a 6-year-old who said, Dad emailed Bobby a letter yesterday. Okay. Now, working memory. Again, you need to process incoming information and remember what you've read. So this is the task that we used. So what I'm going to do is to read you some sentences, and I want you to, if you were a subject in the study, if you were a subject in this study, you would say it out loud. Say your, and then in this case, and you would remember, in this case, I'm going to give you 5 of the words that you said. So you're going to hear the sentence, you're going to fill in a word at the end, and then seconds later, another sentence will come, and your job will be to remember the words that you said, and no writing it down. For the party, the girl wore a pretty pink. Cotton is soft and rocks are. Once a week, we wash the. In the spring, it is very. I throw the ball up and then it comes. Okay. So, see if you can remember the 5 that you said. Anyway, here are the sentences. So, this will give you an idea of a working memory task. Okay, so this is the correlations of fluency and reading comprehension, and you can see that it's very similar in the languages, the four languages. Now, these are the correlations of the oral close task, the grammatical task, and there were significant differences as a function of language. The Estonian, in Estonian, where I think that obviously processing of the syntactic information is more critical than in languages like English and Swedish, that correlation was significantly higher. Croatian comes next because, again, it's a more complex structure than English and Swedish. So we did multiple regressions, and reading fluency was the most significant correlate of reading comprehension in all languages except Estonian. And for Estonian, the oral close was the highest predictor of reading comprehension. Working memory was fairly similar across the languages, and phonological awareness was usually did not even enter into the multiple regression, because I think by the time you get to, in terms of reading comprehension, decoding becomes less important. I forgot to say that the children were all 8 or 9 years old in these four countries. So, I think word reading fluency is a measure of retrieval, word retrieval, and both memory and vocabulary. And obviously reading comprehension relies heavily on memory, and so you need fast and efficient word retrieval. So Zvia was right, and I was wrong. And oh, by the way, I should have made it clear that word recognition accuracy, pseudo-word recognition accuracy did not enter into these equations, that fluency really captured most of the variance. Now, I'm going to switch topics, which I hadn't intended to do, but since yesterday there was so much of a discussion about bilingualism, I thought I would just briefly present some of the research that I've done on bilingualism, and I think it's relevant to some of the discussions that we had yesterday. I conducted a longitudinal study in one of the places in Vancouver, one of the areas in Vancouver called North Vancouver, and it's an area where at that time 20% of the children had a language other than English as the first language. And here is a list of the languages that were spoken by the children in the study. The most common ones were Cantonese, the language of Hong Kong and South China, and Farsi. There were many immigrants from Iran. So what we did was assess them in kindergarten, which is age 5, the first year of school, in Canada. And we gave them measures of letter recognition, phonological awareness, and oral close, the syntactic awareness, to determine the children who were at risk and for literacy, reading problems. So what our idea was that we would institute an intervention at that point and see whether we could prevent most of the reading difficulties. So based on this, we found that about 25% of the children who had English as a first language were at risk, and about 50% of the children who had English as a second language were at risk. And by the way, I should say these children all came to school. The ones who, the English language learners, or ESL, they had little or no English when they entered kindergarten in September. And they spoke one of those 30 languages at home. We did our testing in December, so they had 3.5 months of immersion in English. And so, being 5-year-olds and being at the right point in their development, half of them caught up very quickly. But there were still a significant portion who were at risk. And we followed them for 8 years into grade 7 when they were 13 years old. And this is the number of children, the percentage of children who were showing reading problems. And this is both comprehension and decoding problems. So it's about 1.5%. So I'll talk a little bit about the intervention. So they received an intervention which in the beginning was phonological awareness and vocabulary, and then later into reading comprehension, both strategies, vocabularies, and some work, although not as much as I would have liked, on the morphological structure of English words, prefixes, roots and suffixes, etc. Now, most of this intervention was done in the classroom with some pull-out if the child was really struggling. So this was a kind of RTI, or response to intervention model, before RTI had been invented, or at least was widely known. So the children in this study improved very significantly after good reading instruction. The percentage of dyslexics decreased to a small number, and children who were English language learners had reading and spelling skills that were equal to native English speakers. And here is an example of this. This is a word attack, a decoding test. And the red line is the children of English as a first language who are not showing any reading problems. The aqua bar is the children who had English as a second language, and we're not showing any reading problems. And you can see both groups are above the 85th percentile. This is based on North American norms. So they're doing very well. But look at the dyslexics. The yellow is the dyslexics who were monolingual, had English as a first language. And the green are the dyslexics who had English as a second language. And they are doing significantly better than the monolingual dyslexics. They still haven't caught up in this particular task to the typical readers, but they're doing very well. This is pseudo-word reading fluency. And again, it's the same pattern that the dyslexics who have English as a second language are doing significantly better than the monolingual dyslexics. This is the phoneme syllable deletion task where the dyslexics, bilinguals, have almost caught up to the English first language children or the normal readers, English as a second language. So, okay. They also, this is spelling. And in this case, even with the typical readers, the children who had English as a second language had significantly higher scores than the monolingual typical readers. And of course, the same thing was true with the dyslexics. So, and here's the reason for this. What I forgot to say is that children in Canada, at least in the big cities in Canada, can go to what we call heritage language classes, supported by the government. They go after school, or sometimes on Saturdays or Sundays. So they are the ones who have Chinese as a first language, one of the dialects of Chinese, are learning to read Chinese. This sentence says, "I like watching television." So look at the visual discrimination and visual complexity and visual memory that's required to read that sentence. For English spelling, you do need a good visual memory because you can't sound out. So my idea was that being exposed to this other writing system, especially the Chinese writing system, in a way may train your visual memory. I think all of you speak Arabic. For those of us who can't read Arabic, this is also a complex visual discrimination task and visual memory. Look at how the letters are joined together, how there are all these marks above and below. So it's a different visual task than reading English, but the idea, being exposed to it. And what I didn't say is that Farsi is written in Arabic script. So the children who go to Farsi classes are learning to write Arabic script. This is pseudo-word spelling. This is a particularly difficult task for a dyslexic because you can't use visual memory. You just have to sound out the words. And again, the bilingual dyslexics are almost at the level of the typical readers. And of course, not only do you need visual memory, but you also need phonological awareness skills for English spelling. And if you're exposed to any other language, my hypothesis is that you develop a greater awareness of the sounds of languages because you've been exposed to more than one language. And even this oral close, this syntactic test, the dyslexics, the bilingual dyslexics have higher scores than the monolingual dyslexics. The children were also instructed in strategies and in some work with words. It was not as sophisticated as the interventions that we've heard here, but this was a while ago. And if I could do this study again, I would work more on some of the skills that we heard described yesterday. But the point is that this is a standardized reading comprehension test. The both the ELL and the typical readers are not different from each other. They're about the 65th percentile. But again, there's no disadvantage for the bilingual dyslexics. So, my conclusion is bilingualism is good for dyslexics. But the other conclusion that I think is a lot more controversial is that English is a good language for dyslexics. And most people are shocked by that because it's irregular and unpredictable. But you think about it, and what I said before, for many English words, you cannot read letter by letter. If you have trouble retrieving the sounds of the letters, or as you get older, if you can't do it quickly if you're dyslexic, then you've got to use some other strategy, even from the very beginning. And that strategy is essentially memorizing words and recognizing words as wholes, and because decoding doesn't work, or it doesn't work completely. Think about that GI. You'd have to know those words to know which pronunciation of G, and you would have had to memorize, not necessarily consciously, those words. So, and I think we heard a little bit yesterday about how dyslexics in other languages are sometimes not so dyslexic or dyslexic at all in learning English. So, I would like to close with a commercial. Some of you may have noticed on the tables outside, there are these leaflets for a book that I've written. It's really trying to understand dyslexia and other learning disabilities from a variety of perspectives, from case studies and famous people who had some sort of a learning disability, but also to look at what we're doing in the schools. And I think I probably don't have to convince many of the people in this room, but we simply are not finding the children who need help, and we're not giving them the help that they need. And at least part of the reason is this very elaborate assessment process that we often make the children go through. And in my country, and I know in the US, they may have to wait 2 years before they get this assessment, and 2 years where often nothing happens to them. So they don't get the help that they need at a time when they need it. And that is very destructive, not only of their cognitive processing, but of their self-esteem, etc. So I think that's a really important issue, and in the book I propose some solutions to that. So, thank you very much.
Are there any questions? I think we'll leave the mic on this side of
I have 2 questions about the bilingualism stuff. First of all, when you did the longitudinal study, did you see when it happened? When did the 50% become, was there a timeline of, you started in kindergarten and looked at the first grade and something. What was the timeline of the bilinguals catching up? That's one question. Wait, and I have another question. And my second question was about the orthography, what you were talking about now, but the orthography type. Were there differences? Because you showed us an example of Chinese, an example of Arabic. Was there a difference? And were children who were bilingual in languages that had the same orthography, did they show different patterns? Or is it just being bilingual is good for you? It doesn't matter what the topology is?
Okay, for the first question, at the end of grade 1, we had 5% who were struggling, and then it went down each year after that. So there was but there was, in kindergarten was the more intensive intervention, again classroom-based, but still intensive, and in grade 1. So we were almost there by the end of grade 1, but it continued. It decreased a little bit each year. I've tried to look at the differences between children who have different first languages. And the one difference that comes out is that on the syntax test, the Chinese children, even if they're good readers and fluent, really have difficulty with it. You may know that Chinese has no plurals, no inflections, no prepositions, no verb tenses, and that really, especially plurals and verb tenses, even though they seem to be fluent, it gives them difficulty. We found that children who had a Romance language as a first language did better on the phonological awareness tests. But other than that, I think it's just the exposure. At this age, they're 5, 6 years old when they start to get exposed to English. And I keep asking my colleagues who work in the brain area, what is it about the 5 and 6-year-old brain that's different from the adult brain? And nobody knows the answer to that, but it's clearly different. They just soak up the language if they have good models and good teaching.
We have some data, I mentioned it already in previous discussion of dyslexics, Dutch dyslexics. This was a there's several studies showing that Dutch dyslexics do surprisingly well. Some group of Dutch dyslexics do surprisingly well. They actually have normal reading skills to, as you mentioned there, and the sort of base of their, we suspected that the Dutch dyslexics who are surprisingly good at English, we found they had superior orthographic skills in Dutch, which of course is another, we've talked about that at several published. You and I, together with Esther, reunion of the triumvirate, the superior skills in orthographic ability are possibly helping with English with its difficulties with phonology, so we look for compensation in orthography. There's also, I would also emphasize morphology rather than hot words. Most words in English are not monomorphemic. They are, they've got 2 or more morphemes, and I think it's them. And English has been, I think, correctly described as Representative Mineski said it, phonology and morphology. So, and I think that's true. And even though I strongly disagree with most of the things that Chomsky and Halle have to say about English being optimal, certainly not for the learner, it probably well described as a morphophonic script. So I think the morphology thing, and there's several studies that have looked at whether it's morphemic than some of these other Swedish, Estonian, and Croatian. I'm not sure, because I think the writing system must represent both, but possibly there is more importance. There may be more importance to morphemes and morphological knowledge in English. Or it certainly does preserve morpheme extensive knowledge. Well, that might be another factor that's affecting some of the experiences.
No, I think that there is some evidence, although it's not very good, about the superior visual memory skills of dyslexics. I know we have some, but there's not a whole lot of support for this, although I think it's probably true. Now, about English morphology, we hardly do any work in most of the schools that I've seen on prefixes, roots, and suffixes, which, considering English has 600,000 words in it, you need some help with vocabulary. And many of the words don't fit into, you can't use any kind of morphology like that, but some you can, especially at the higher level. So we should be paying more attention to that.
Thank you very much.